So just sitting down in this auditorium right here, the only one auditorium. I just met with Dr. Zimmerman, and he really liked the fly that I did for the event, and just waiting on this little discussion forum to start, I think.
Vice President or Professor Sandy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I just went for food because I was hungry.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I am Professor Holmes Dubois of the Osceola Campus Speech Department, and I see a lot of my faces out there, but I see a lot of other faces too, which is exciting. So thank you for coming to our event today. Today's speaker is Dr. Jonathan Zimmerman, and he came to us this morning from Pennsylvania, which I'm sure was chillier than it was in lovely Florida this morning, which is great. He's going to speak to us today about how we can communicate with each other, how we can talk across our differences even in troubling times, such as the poster said, in the age of Trump, which has a lot of people concerned about controversial issues and discussing topics with people and worrying if a hat will be ripped off of your head or if someone will fire you because you have an opposing point of view. So he's got lots of good things to tell us. I would like to acknowledge the Sue Boozatter Endowed Chair in Communication and Student Development, which provided the funding for Dr. Zimmerman's trip, as well as Dr. Pedoni, our interim campus executive dean, who provided money for the snacks. Woo! Woo! So, yay, all those people. Speaking of snacks, do me a favor, there is a sign on the door for this auditorium that says no eating. So I see that you're all eating, which is fine, but just take your wrappers and your scraps and all that and try to find a trash can instead of leaving them like you would on an airplane and just walking away. So take care of your litter. Okay. So Dr. Zimmerman has written 6 books, including exciting titles like The Case for Contention and Campus Politics, which was reported as lost from our campus library. That's because I had it checked out too long. But I returned it the other day, so now you too can check out Campus Politics if you're interested in reading it. And he also writes frequently columns for the New York Times and the Washington Post, so you'll see him out and about in the media representing his point of view. So if you would, please help me welcome Dr. Jonathan Zimmerman.
Thanks to Deirdre, and thanks to all of you for coming out. The only thing I can conclude is there's not a whole lot to do up here in Orlando. Maybe you should get out more. Deirdre mentioned that the copy of my book is returned to the library, so you can get it, or you can just wait for the movie. But they're never the same. Never the same books and movie. The very first book that I wrote, somebody sent me this 800 number from a publisher's clearinghouse that allegedly tracked your sales. And being a young man, being a naif, I actually did it. So I punched in the 800 number, and then I got the computer voice, right? And it said, "Good morning. You have sold 0 books today." And that wasn't getting me any closer to God, so I haven't done it since. I wanted to begin in a moment of levity because what I have to say is not happy. This talk is a bummer. I can't put it any other way. I wish it wasn't a bummer, but it is. And here's why. I think in our country we're in an unprecedented moment of political polarization and mutual vilification. An awful political moment. But worse than that, it's a challenge for our educational institutions that they have not stepped up to. our moment is not just a political problem, it's an educational problem. And by and large, our educational institutions, our universities, our K-12 schools, they have either ignored this problem, or they've made it worse, or they've exacerbated it. And so I'm going to try to lay out that big bummer of an idea, and then give you a modest set of suggestions about what educators and citizens might be able to do to alleviate some of this. This talk is a bummer. I mean, we hear a lot about how Russians tried to undermine our democracy, and by the way, they did, right? I mean, look, it's true that the Mueller report showed that the Trump administration didn't collude with Russians to do that, right? But did Russians try to undermine our democracy? They absolutely did. In fact, Mueller indicted a bunch of them. We hear a lot about how Russians tried to undermine our democracy, but each of us, especially if we're educators, needs to ask ourselves what we have done to address the problem of our frayed democracy. And I think the answer is not enough, all of us. Sometimes, indeed, we've succumbed to the same spirit of polarization and mutual vilification, and we've actually made things worse. I'm now wondering if there may be a way that I could put this somewhere so I don't have to hold it. Is it, or it just feels odd to be like no, we're not going to hold the mic. Yeah, it just feels strange walking around. I feel like I should start burst into song or something. This one goes out to a very special little lady. Yeah. I wrote this back in '68. Much better. Yeah. Here we go. Now I can just like grab this as I see it. You know. All right. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. Good. That's better. And friends, I'm going to try to do this quickly because I want to hear from you. I am much more interested in hearing what you have to say than what I have to say. Hopefully I'll provoke you into doing that. Now let's see. Okay. So what is the problem? Friends, we cannot blame it all on he who shall not be named. All right? We can't. He's played a role in it, and we'll get to that. But we can't play the game of blaming everything on him, because he's a product of our moment as much as he is a cause of it. And that moment is a moment of intense polarization and ideological segregation. Friends, I'll lay it out for you in really plain English, okay? We now have research comparing from 1970s to today the likelihood that you have a neighbor of a different political party, the likelihood that you have a friend or a lover of a different political party, all right? The likelihood that you would want to allow your child to marry somebody of a different political party. And what we found since the 70s is those numbers have plummeted, straight line vector. So what this means is, back in the 70s or the 60s, it was much more likely that you would have a friend of a different political party or a lover of a different political party than you do now. Or a neighbor, all right? We've even segmented ourselves politically in our communities. So 40 years ago, it was much more likely that the guy living next to you was of a different political party than it is now. And here's the kicker and the worst, to me, statistic of all. The more education you have, the less likely it is that you report having conversations with people of a different political party. In other words, education is a failure. Education does precisely the opposite of what we like to say it does, which is expose you to stuff that isn't you, right? Isn't that why you're here?
Yes.
Right? That's the whole point. And you know what? It doesn't work. It has the opposite effect. The more education you have, the less likely it is that you will have friends, interlocutors, conversants of another political party. Friends, there are many, many reasons for this, and we could spend the whole afternoon talking about them. One of the obvious ones is what happened to the mass media, which is the mass media segmented itself. I'm sure you've heard that back in the day, i.e. my day, there were 3 channels, right? I mean, there were just 3 channels. And that's what you had to watch, and you picked between them. And so those channels had to serve enormously wide audiences, right? Now there are 180 or 780 channels, and nothing's on. All right? But the larger point is those channels are tailored to narrow ideological niches. You can find your channel, we all know what they are, right? And it can feed you your point of view and reinforce your point of view and light up all those pleasure centers in your brain when you hear somebody reinforcing your point of view. And by the way, saying that the other team is an idiot, right? That feels really good too, right? All right? And you can just get that 24/7. Or you can get it through your phone, your feed. All right? Back to that number. Time for your politics now, right? Time for your 6 a.m. feed, tailored exactly to what we know you like based on your search history. So you will only encounter things that feed your biases and confirm them. And you will never encounter, probably, things that don't. That's a big part of the story. And yes, let's be honest, although it wasn't caused by Donald Trump, it was exacerbated by him. Friends, we've never had a president like this. All right, I'm a historian, and this is a really hard moment for historians because our stock in trade is precedent, right? We see something or someone and we say, like, where's this happened before? Like, what does this remind us of? You know what? It doesn't remind us of anything. We've had 44 presidents and then we've had Donald Trump. All right, really? 41 of them had held elective office before they got to the White House. The other 3 were victorious generals, right? Grant and Eisenhower and Zachary Taylor, all right? That's it. And then we had this guy. So we've never had a president who calls a whole group of immigrants rapists. We've never had a president who calls major newspapers enemies of people. We've never had a president that openly calls women pigs. We've never had a president that routinely refers to his opponents, his political opponents, as losers, morons, dummies. Echoing the snark of reality TV, which is where he came from. It's a phone call. Yeah. Anyone expecting a call? Okay. All right. Echoing the snark of reality TV, which is, by the way, where he comes from. Now, he is the president. He is the most powerful person. All right? And his behavior does represent a threat to the norms that we used to abide by. All the things I just referred to, I call undemocratic practices. Why? Because they substitute name-calling for argument. Because they vilify absolutely one's opponent, so they're not just somebody you disagree with, but somebody who is, again, evil, moron, dummy. That's the biggest threat. And you know what the second biggest threat is? That the rest of us imitate him. That we go right down there with him. Down into that vortex. So, I'm a Democrat. I didn't vote for Trump. But I'm appalled at how many of my fellow Democrats who also hate Trump Act like them. How? Well, if you oppose same-sex marriage, you're a homophobe. If you oppose affirmative action, you're a racist. If you have some doubts about the Me Too movement, obviously you're a sexist. You're a mansplainer, you're a white-splainer, you're a racist, you're a sexist, you're an elitist, you're an ableist. You're an ist. That's Trumpian. Brought to you by people that loathe Trump, generally. But it's Trumpian, again, insofar as it substitutes name-calling for argument, and it vilifies utterly the person on the other side. You're not even a human. Like, I got nothing to say to you, right? You're beneath human. You're a word, a bad word. There's an enormous ideological imbalance among university faculties. It does vary sometimes, like based on discipline. In business schools and econ departments, you'll find a few more Republicans. Also in the natural sciences, a few more. In the humanities, social sciences, forget about it. I read recently that anthropology, 97 to 3. 97% blue, 3% red. And who are those Republican anthropologists? My heart goes out to them. If you're out there, I feel your pain. All right? Look, that's not good. And again, I say this, I'm part of the problem. I mean, I'm a cute, look, my dad was in the Peace Corps, he was hired by JFK, I was in the Peace Corps, I have a PhD, I'm Jewish, I'm like the most hilarious caricature of a Democrat that there is. I'm like a cartoon, all right? But the point is the faculty should not have everyone be like me. And when they do, it becomes extremely hard for them to address the problems that I'm describing, right? If the problem is an inability to speak across difference, how are you going to address it if there isn't difference on the faculty? All right? That's an enormous challenge. And please, just to be clear, I'm not saying there are no Republican faculty. I know there are, but they are in a minority. And especially in the elite, expensive schools, like the one I teach at, it's even worse. When I say it's even worse, I mean the skew, the ideological skew is even worse. Then, the other thing that's depressing is the low overall status of teaching in this country, at every level, including the university level. Friends, I'm a teacher, all right? But Deirdre didn't mention that in my intro, and that's not the reason I was invited here. All right, I may be a really good teacher, I may be a terrible one. You know what? Nobody knows. That's not good, right? The reason I was invited here is because of the stuff I've written. All right? And this is a huge problem. What's the problem? The undervaluing of teaching. Why is that relevant to this discussion? Because when you actually study teaching at every level, including the universities, most students report that in their classes, they don't engage in substantive dialogue. They don't exchange in back and forth, all right, in face-to-face discussions with people they disagree with. So should we be surprised that, like, either they don't know how to do it or don't want to? I don't find that surprising at all, right? If you don't learn how to do it, why are you going to do it? Right? If what you think politics is what you see on TV, well, you don't see a lot of back and forth on TV. Susan, my wife, and I, sometimes we'll be watching, cable news at night, and they'll say, okay, after we sell you some stuff, we're going to have a debate about immigration, whatever the subject is. And then we'll see these four talking heads, and they rant at each other. Or just into the atmosphere, at nobody in particular. Just have sort of sequential, rants. And then we'll end and we'll look at each other and we'll say, was that a debate? It wasn't. It was just sequential rants. Friends, that's what we're socializing people to think politics is. And our educational institutions are not interrupting that. Nobody comes out of the womb able to hold discussions with people from the other side. Nobody comes out of the womb saying, I'm going to listen to everything you say and, disagree reasonably, even if I don't like it, and not kill you and not say you that. Blank, blank, blank. All right? No. In fact, if you believe the psychologists, it's quite the opposite. We're probably much more hardwired to say, like, I'm awesome and you suck. Because that feels really good. All right? It does. It's like, I'm so awesome and you really suck. And so you've got to learn it. But I would argue, in part because we don't value teaching nearly enough. We don't actually inscribe those practices enough in our classrooms. It's a hard thing to do, right? It's a lot easier just to get in front of a bunch of students and jaw, which, by the way, is what I'm doing right now. All right? That's a whole lot easier. All right? Not really going to teach them how to speak across their differences if I'm just doing the speaking. No, it isn't. All right? But that's what a whole lot of teaching is. And it gets worse. All right? I warned you. I mean, I'm trying to be as nice about this as I can, but this sucks, all of it. All right? At our colleges and universities, we, most of us, have also embraced and furthered a much bigger cultural shift that I call the psychologizing of politics. That is, the expression of political views and attitudes in psychological terms. Friends, let me just get this out there. I'm not against psychology. I'll save the details, but my family and I have been great beneficiaries of psychology. All right? What I'm saying, though, friends, is that psychology and politics don't play very well. If you say that you were microaggressed or triggered by something that I said today, I've got pretty much one thing to say in response. Sorry. Seriously. Maybe I might ask you a little bit more about why you were microaggressed or triggered, but I certainly won't question that you were. I can't look into your soul and tell you what you're feeling. All I can do is say I'm sorry. But this is a problem. All right? It's a cul-de-sac. All right? It doesn't lend itself to political discussion. Feelings are not a good arena for talking like this. What's a microaggression? It was coined way back when by a psychiatrist at Harvard named Clarence Pierce to connote these kind of subtle, indirect, unconscious insults, especially around race and gender. And it's been revived in recent years, and there are many campuses, perhaps even this one, where faculty and students receive training in what a microaggression is. Let me give you some examples. Where are you from? So this is considered a microaggression because, well, maybe it highlights the person's difference, right? They may be an immigrant, but they grew up in California. It's like, where are you from? I'm from California. Like, dude, I'm as American as you. Asking an Asian student for help in math, because that reinforces their distinctiveness. So some of these microaggressions are considered harmful because they, underscore people's difference. But then it's interesting, some of them are considered bad because they minimize difference. So when I look at you, I don't see color. There's only one race, the human race. The US is a melting pot. These are all terms that are allegedly microaggressions because they're small, but they're insulting, either because they underscore difference or because they paper it over. Other universities have added more to the list. Lame, like, oh, that's so lame. Is considered a microaggression for reasons you might guess, right? Insulting to people that have some sort of physical handicap. Politically correct at some campuses has been deemed a microaggression because, it connotes that perhaps you're a minority or being too sensitive. So in the era of microaggressions, PC is actually not itself PC. Right? You just can't bring together people and think that they're going to start talking to each other. All right? They're more likely going to look into their phones. One of the things I like to do when I walk across campus, just to keep myself occupied, is I try to count the number of people who are stationary and alone and not looking at a device. Try it sometime. It's pretty interesting. You can find them. Occasionally they're reading this ancient object called a book, with this pages and binding, this thing from another era. But look, it's simpler, it's easier just to do this.
isn't it? Right? If you do that, well, you don't know who he or she really is, what they're thinking, whether you might insult them, whether they might insult you. Who needs it? Well, I would argue that all of us need it. All of us need it. And we're not doing it. At my own campus, I was so frustrated after 2016 with the lack of real discussion that I created a set of structured conversations between students at the University of Pennsylvania, where I teach, and students at Cairn University, formerly Philadelphia Bible College, a school with a very different history and a very different political profile. Because at Penn, there were some Trump voters, but they came out to me in my office with the door shut, and they're like, they're like closeted gays, you know? And I'm like, just be yourself, you know, don't live a lie, you know, it gets better, right? But that's really what it was like, because I was like, I would love for you to speak up in classes, because I think all of us are gonna learn from it. They're like, are you kidding? That's easy for you to say, Professor. Like, do you know the shit I'll have to take for that? Like, no, thank you. So what we did was we got a bus and we brought a whole bunch of Penn kids up to Philadelphia Bible College, and then a bunch of Philadelphia Bible College students came to Penn, and then we had somebody interview them over the phone afterwards, about 100 people. That was really interesting because, you know, a lot of the Penn students said, you know, I met this guy who voted for Trump, and like he wasn't a monster. Like, he didn't have like fangs or horns, and you know, I didn't agree with him about most things, but you know, the Eagles were winning and we talked about football for a while, and he was all right. You know, you know, a lot of the Cairn students, Philadelphia Bible College students, you know, they the other thing they taught our students is that a lot of people that voted for Trump hate him too, and our students weren't aware of that. They just hated the other team more. Or they came out of pro-life communities, and that's, you know, that was their dominant issue. As you might guess, some of the Penn students were like, no, wait a second, you're pro-life. You really think Donald Trump is pro-life? I mean, have you investigated his past statements on this subject or even his behavior? And they would say, and I think that's fair to say, it's a fair point, but we know that Hillary isn't. That makes sense. Right? I mean, I think if I were as vehemently pro-life as those people, I think I would not have voted for Hillary. I can't say I would have voted for Trump, but I certainly would have voted for Hillary. So the point is, you know, you learn things, right? You actually learn stuff other than my enemy is an idiot, all right? By actually sitting down and talking to people, and yet, let's remember that that was a tiny little experiment, and it was entirely self-selected, right? So if there was any social scientists in the room, as I'm sure there is, the first thing they would point out is that, you know, the people that, this was a voluntary enterprise, right? And the people that chose to do these conversations were already predisposed to that, right? So that's an easy lift, right? The much heavier lift is what you do with all the other people, i.e., you know, everyone who doesn't want to have this discussion. And this, friends, is where schools have got to enter. I'm going to be quiet very soon because I want to hear from you. I've been doing, since 2016, a kind of tour where I go around to high schools and colleges and try to do workshops and other events where we actually talk, right? Where we actually find out what our differences are and try to talk about them in a mutually respectful way. And I have been struck, as I give these talks, how many people do want to find a way out of this morass. I would argue that one of the reasons I was invited here is that sentiment existing, right? People want to find a way. And so what I've been promulgating is a kind of checklist, both for teachers and for citizens, about how we can do this, how we can engage in these tough conversations. And I'll just give you a flavor of that, and then I'll shut up. The first thing, friends, if you're an educator, or you plan to be, as I'm sure some of you do, to have a discussion, you have to distinguish facts and opinions. It's not always easy in this day of fake news and alternative facts. All right? But Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was my senator a long time ago from New York, famously said, everyone is entitled to their own opinions, but not their own facts. So in classrooms especially, we have to debate things that are debatable and not debate things that are not. So let me just give you an example. I know, just as a matter of social science and surveys, that there are millions of my fellow citizens that do not believe that human beings share DNA with other creatures, that don't believe in the theory of evolution, okay? I think it is their right not to believe it. I think it is their right to say they don't believe it in every way they can or want. I would lay down everything to protect that right. But I do not want biology classrooms or any other classrooms engaging in a debate about whether we share DNA with other creatures, because we do. You don't have to believe that, all right? But we're not going to debate it. When you do engage with somebody of a different party or perspective, use the right question. And the right question is not, how could you vote for that effing idiot? That is not the right question. That's just a bar. That's just a dagger. It's not a question at all, right? It's a dagger posing as a question, right? So don't say, how could you vote for that thing? You say, that's interesting. You know, you voted for Hillary and I didn't. How come? Right? That's a question, right? Because it doesn't bury a bar inside of it. Avoid being called. You're a libtard, you're a wingnut, you watch faux news, whatever it is. Again, that's what he does every day. All right? Don't be afraid of emotion, but don't mistake it for argument. Friends, I'm not saying don't be emotional. I'm emotional, okay? And I would argue at this moment in political history, if you're not emotional about something, you may be a sociopath. All right? Okay, so it's not that I'm against emotion. What I'm saying is emotion's not a substitute for argument. Like, the worst awful, racist, bigoted people in human history have felt what they felt like really strongly. All right? That doesn't reference the validity of their argument. All right? So don't confuse emotion and argument. And most of all, and this is where I'll conclude, support the institutions that teach us how to do this. They're out there. Okay, there are nonprofits with titles like Common Ground, Common Discourse, and there are institutions like this one that invited me down here. All right, they're trying to do something about this. They exist. So I'll leave you with one image. One of the places I went on my road show was a Mennonite school near Philadelphia. The Mennonites are fascinating because the conservative, the Orthodox Mennonites are, check this out, pacifists and against marriage equality, which are like two things you don't see co-joined very often, right? I mean, if I went on Broad Street in Philly or Broadway or downtown Orlando and I met a pacifist, I would bet my now totally depleted life saving, because we just sent 2 kids to college, that they'd support marriage equality, right? But the Mennonites, they don't, for a whole variety of theological reasons, and they wanted me to come out and talk to them about how to talk about the subject. And so I did the best I could in this beautiful old chapel. And I said at the end, most of all, I want to thank Ms. whatever her name was, the teacher that invited me to hold this discussion. She stands up and people clap, and I look at her and she's bawling. And it was just an amazingly powerful moment, because it reminded me both how difficult it is to do this work, but also how important, right? How imperative it is to do it. My father died last year, and the very last discussion I had with him was about this subject. It was the day before he died, and we're watching some cable news show, and we're watching people rant at each other. And he said, how are we ever going to learn to talk to each other? Friends, I do not have the answer to that, okay? But I'm thankful. I'm thankful to Dad for asking, and also to you for asking. So, thank you very much.
Questions? I have the mic if somebody wants to raise a hand, I can come by and make sure that we all hear the question, as well as the the answer. Faculty, you're all set. I can ask a
Here's
question.
down question down here.
I don't necessarily have a question,
Okay,
sort of
come.
a discussion purposes. How do you feel about the structure that public education was built upon? I feel as though the public education system in America is sort of conforming, like teachers almost force you in a sense to conform, so there's no civil discourse. You know, Jordan Peterson always says, assume the person you're listening to knows something that you don't, and I feel that the structure in America doesn't allow for that to happen. So, what's your take on that?
Well, I'm sorry, your name, sir?
My name is Vance Whiteyear. I'm an international student from the Bahamas.
From the Bahamas. Thank you so much for the question. You know, it's Vance, right? I mean, Vance has pointed to a huge contradiction between the stories we tell and the practices that we have. If you look at the website of most school districts, they have a policy in which they favor the teaching of controversial issues. They'll say, and of course, we support the teaching of controversial issues. We think it's very important for citizenship. But then when you go into classrooms, you find it's very rare. All right? It's not absent. I'm sure you had teachers that engaged in that, and I know I did, but they were not a majority. And in the last book that I wrote, we tried to figure out why that is, and there are a couple of reasons for it. All right? One of them is that teachers have too darn much to do. All of you are products of No Child Left Behind, almost all of you. And what that means is that your schools and your teachers were evaluated on how well you did on standardized tests. Having a really in-depth discussion about, you know, the border wall might not help you do better on your standardized tests, so we're not going to do it. That's one reason. The other thing we found is that teachers, when you interview them about their own training, their colleges and schools and all that, are themselves often not trained to lead these discussions. You ask teachers, so when you were trained to be a teacher, as I'm sure some of you are, did you have a unit about how to teach about controversial issues? Most teachers say no. So like, should we be surprised like that they don't do it? Okay, so that's another thing. And then finally, this is really depressing, the courts have actually narrowed teachers' rights. Yes, teachers' rights to speak in their classroom. So if I may, one very important example everyone should know about. In 2003, right before the United States invaded Iraq, a teacher in Indiana was leading a lesson about the Iraq situation. And if you read about that period, you remember it, you know there was this moment where it became clear we were going to invade Iraq, but we hadn't yet, and there was a big anti-war protest on the wall in Washington. She's teaching about this from Time for Life, or Time for Kids. It's like a district approved kids version of Time magazine. And there's an article about this protest in Washington, including a picture of the protest. Standard stuff, you know, people counting signs and chanting. And a kid in the class, in the 5th grader, says, her name is Mayor, Ms. Mayor, have you ever been to an anti-war protest? And she said in response, yes. As a matter of fact, I drove by one in Bloomington, that's where the University of Indiana is, the other day, and I honked my horn in support. And I also believe that human beings should try to settle their differences peacefully rather than with violence, which is why I'm the faculty advisor to like the school peer mediation organization. Fired. Upheld by a federal appeals court, which said that when she's in school, she doesn't have a right to say what she thinks. Now, if she had told all the kids that the war in Iraq was a very bad idea, all right, I'd be inclined to fire her too. That's not her job, okay? She does have a right to say what she thinks, but she doesn't have a right to indoctrinate the kids. I don't think there was any evidence that she was actually indoctrinating them. Look, when the war began, ironically, the teachers in Chicago asked me to come out there and talk about how to teach the war. And even though you've only met me for an hour, you could probably predict what I said. I said, listen, you have a much harder job than I do, right? That's for starters, okay? I can't tell you what to do. But I can tell you 2 things you must not do. You must not tell them the war is a good idea, and you must not tell them the war is a bad idea. Because your job is not to get them either to agree or disagree with the war. Your job is to provide them with both the skills and the knowledge that they can use to come to their view of the world. All right? Well, this teacher comes up to me right afterwards, and she's very Hamish. If you're ethically sound, Hamish is Yiddish for like warm or friendly. She says, Professor Zimmerman, thank you so much for your talk. I really liked it. I'm like, oh, thank you. And then she says, it's only when people teach like you want us to teach that the students will realize that this war is a great imperial misadventure. Friends, that's cynical. It's Zimmerman's fallacy. Ever heard of Zimmerman's fallacy? It's very famous. Never heard of it. That's strange. Here's how it goes. If everybody debated and discussed, really, and spoke across the aisle, unencumbered by propaganda and misinformation and fake news, they'd agree with me. That's not real dialogue. That's not real discussion. That's pseudo-discussion. All right? If you take all this seriously, they are going to disagree with you, and you've got to let them do that. All right? But it's hard when the courts are saying that you don't have a right to speak at all. Now, there are 14,000 school districts in this country, and they all vary, right? If Deborah Merrick did that in Lower Manhattan, she wouldn't have been, fired. She would have been made Teacher of the Year, right? So it's not that, every teacher is getting fired from this, but that is the environment we're working in. And if the teacher doesn't have free speech rights, how is he going to lead students in a discussion involving speaking freedom?
What's your solution to fixing the school system? I'm just curious.
Adrian, can you ask a broader question?
I know,
I'm on a big picture.
Yeah, do you want to change the way teachers teach, their techniques, or better teaching units, or is it more a debate, educational type, lectures, I guess?
Well, look, I think the shortest thing I would say is that schools exist for a lot of reasons, okay? One reason they exist is to help people get skills for the workplace, right? To help them learn how to sustain themselves, and that's all fine and good. People need work and they need jobs. But Adrian, there's one job that each and every one of us is going to have. Each and every person in the United States. And that's the job of citizen. That's what I think the primary purpose of school is, to educate citizens. And I think we do an extremely poor job of that, okay? If you take a field like mine, like history, when you interview the students and you ask them to rank the major subjects in order of interest, history's last. Boys like it more than girls, but just a little bit more. Why is that? Well, I would surmise that it's because we present it as a series of facts, names, and dates, instead of a series of questions. You know what the most popular subject is? Math. Yes. Again, boys like it a little bit more than girls, but math is always the most popular, and I would say, with respect to Adrian's question, the reason for that is quite simple. Even the worst math teacher on earth has to present a puzzle. Right? It would almost be impossible to teach math without some sort of puzzle, like solve this, right? Now, of course, everything is a puzzle, but we don't present it that way. Here's the textbook, right? The monument between covers, as I call it. This is it, baby. All of United States history right here, all right? Memorize the following 10 things for the test on Wednesday. How does that make sense? It doesn't. All right? That makes another echo chamber. You just, in this case, happen to be echoing the textbook, right? That's not thinking. That's not citizenship. All right? If what we really wanted to do was to school people for citizenship, the schools would look very different than they do now. There would be much more accent upon public issues. All right? There would be much more intersection between the school and the community. We would have different people from different political groups coming in. In wartime, we would have veteran groups visiting the school. We would have pacifists and protesters visiting the schools. All right? We don't do that. And the biggest question, the one that has energized and depressed me for my whole career, is what if there isn't actually a democratic constituency for what I'm calling democratic education? These practices I was just describing, I like to call democratic because I think you need them to be a citizen, and I do believe that. But what if the demos doesn't? Right? Democracy, demos. Demos is the people. What do you do then? What if you live in a democracy where the majority of people don't want democratic education? I don't know the answer. All right? All I can do is just keep going out there and trying to plead for it. All right? I don't know how many people want it. I think in our current environment, probably in some ways fewer than ever before. Right? If you really hate the other team, you certainly don't want its perspective represented or reflected in school.
Professor Irizarry?
Just in case.
Okay, Paul Green? Schuler? Professor Schuler? All right. Does anyone else think you're here for extra credit for someone I didn't mention? Okay.
This is the master
That's your
at
name or
work.
that?
His own natural
You
habitat.
can probably put it on Sean Paul Green.
It's who? Okay, thank you. All right, last call for extra credit. Yes, ma'am. Okay, Professor. So I am Professor Holmes Dubois. I have one student here, but I have like 50 of them at 1 o'clock, so it's good to see folks from other professors and other places on the campus. Nice to have you. I am, this year I hold the Sue Lou Zatter Endowed Chair in Communication, which is a long way of saying that I have a little pot of money to spend on activities to bring learning opportunities to campus, and so this is your learning opportunity. We have a great speaker from the University of Pennsylvania who is here to talk to us today about, the topic is, the title of the presentation is Speaking Across Our Differences, the Challenge of Democracy in the Time of, he didn't name him last time, Trump, he who shall not be named. So we're gonna hear an interesting conversation about communication and civility and politics and all kinds of things that I don't want to give away too much of. So Professor Zimmerman comes to us, as I mentioned, from the University of Pennsylvania. And I didn't mention at 1 o'clock, I did have it written down on my little cheat sheet, that he is currently a professor in the Graduate School of Education. He teaches history of education classes, and so he has a nice historical perspective on a lot of the things that we're seeing happening today on college campuses and then in society as a larger whole. He has written 6 books, including one called The Case for Contention, which is one of the ideas he will talk about today, as well as one titled Campus Politics, which until yesterday was showing as lost in the college catalog, but that's because I had it checked out so long that the college just said, we give up, we're tired of sending her overdue notices. But I turned it in yesterday, so if you would like to check out his book, Campus Politics, through your Valencia library card, you're welcome to do that and catch up on more of his thinking. And so now I will just turn over the floor to Dr. Jonathan Zimmerman.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot to Deirdre for inviting me, and thanks to all of you for coming out in the late afternoon. Apparently, you're not allowed to sit in the first row. That seems to be the rule. I also want to give a big shout out to Adrian for doing this fabulous poster of this event. I do lots of speaking engagements around the country, and I haven't seen as eye-catching a poster as that. If you read any of those books that Dr. Holmes Dubois referred to, you may become the first person that's not a blood relative to do so. Although then again, we might be related, because Americans often are, and we don't really like to talk about that either. Friends, I like to begin a talk like this with jokes, because unfortunately the theme is so serious and such a downer. We are at an incredibly difficult moment in the history of our country and of our politics. That question in the 70s, and then you ask it in the remaining decades, the line goes. Similarly, it was more likely you would report having a lover or a girlfriend or boyfriend in another report. More likely that you would report having a neighbor in a different political party.
more likely that you would report simply having a conversation in the past year with somebody of a different political persuasion. So what this means, it's not that everything was a big happy family back then, right? There's always been political contention, disagreement, dissatisfaction in this country. But the difference is there was much more communication between citizens across their differences in prior generations. When I began this story, you probably heard from we grandparents that there were 3 channels. That was it. NBC, CBS, ABC. And, you know, you want either content or to very specific political niches. You know what I'm talking about, right? Okay? So whatever your viewpoint is, you can tune into the channel that echoes it. You don't have to be exposed to anybody else's viewpoint, and you will see it over and over again. And it comes into your phone. You know what? It's seductive. It feels good. The psychologists have taught us that when you see your own view confirmed and the other guy maligned, it feels good. Changes your idea. But it is also, as Judah was saying, it is fed by he who shall not be named. The behavior is what's new. Friends, let me be really clear. No decent teacher would allow their student to do that. This is the difference between belief and as the most culpability, but it's not just him. You know who else it is? Us. He is Trump because he is president, and the second biggest danger is the rest of us going right down there into the vortex, into the darkness with him, including people on my team who say they hate Trump. All right? How do they do it? They just use different words. Okay, you're against marriage equality, you're a homophobe. You're against affirmative action, you must be a racist. You said something critical about Me Too, you must be a sexist. You're a mansplainer, you're a white splainer, you're a racist, you're a sexist, you're a homophobe, you're a racist, all Trumpian. How Trumpian? In the following ways. A, substitutes name calling for argument. Just say a name and pretend that's an argument. And B, vilify your opponent utterly. But it also makes us all dumber. It just does. The entire premise of the university is based on sharing ideas and information so we can teach each other. If we're not saying what we think, we're not teaching each other. And you have incredible events that have happened all over American higher ed. I'll just give you an example at Brandeis, which is outside of Boston. The Asian American Student Association made a piece of public art about microaggressions and included some of the items that I just told you about. You know, Asians are good at math. You know, when I look at you, I don't see race. Then other Asians denounced the exhibit for being microaggressive. And then the artist had to write a mea culpa email which said, I'm very sorry that I triggered or microaggressed anybody with my artwork about microaggression. That's madness. All right? I mean, that really is. Okay? Again, it's not that I'm not objecting to anybody taking offense. I'm objecting to the idea that offense in and of itself should be the arbiter of anything. Friends, words offend. They do. Words of meaning offend somebody. All right? But if we're socializing each other to a world without offense, we are socializing each other to a world without thought. You can't call Rosie O'Donnell a pig. You can't call Africa a shithole. You can't do that, right? Because those behaviors, again, not beliefs, those behaviors, all right, they inhibit the values of democracy, the practices and the norms that we need in order to have a civic conversation. Again, he's not the only violator, remember that, but he is the president, all right? You can't be like him, you can't imitate him, you cannot behave like Donald Trump. Most of you are not educated, so I'm sure some of you will be. Here's what I think you can do. Seek out things that are pitched to the other side, whatever the other side is. So I finally joined the gym at the age of 50. I'm a Republican bro, you know, and I'll see them walk by and they look at what's on my screen and they're like, yeah, Hillary's email server, or you know, whatever it is that they just saw on Fox News. All right, and I'm like, I met that many people who are trying. My priority is avoid the name calling, avoid the stigmatization. You're a libtard. You know, you're a wingnut. You want faux news. All that stuff, all that ugly name calling. All it does is interrupt the possibility of democracy. And it was just for me an incredibly powerful illustration of our movement. How charged it is, how difficult it is, how emotional it is. All right? And what the stakes are. The stakes are nothing less than what democracy is. My father died last year, and the very last conversation I had with him on their subject, as you might guess, it was in a hospital room when you were watching people shout on TV. And he said, are we ever going to